Okay, so thanks. Okay, a lot of animals don't have a nervous system, or don't have a very well-developed one. Sponges don't. Looks like they're the first animals that are at the base of the animal tree of life. But the next stage up are things like jellyfish and sea anemones. They only have 2 layers instead of 3 layers of tissue, but they have what's called a nerve net. So there are neurons, but there's no central area for it. But they can do things like jellyfish. You can see them if they're with their big bells. They can actually make it through the water. They can move, not very well, but good enough for what they need to do. As you get to more and more complex animals, and that corresponds with time, you start seeing central nervous systems. So individuals who have 2 of everything, 2 eyes, 2 kidneys, all that kind of stuff, different sizes of the body. Those things kind of tend to have a more advanced immune system, and that includes insects, right? So insects have a decent immune system. I mean neurons, sorry. And then, of course, you get over to vertebrates, and vertebrates have a very good nervous system. It gets more and more complex the more recent that lineage actually evolved. So the most advanced nervous systems that you find usually are in, let's say, birds and mammals. But it also looks like, in fact, that there's a lot of fish that are pretty smart in terms of cognition, just so you know. So the central part of the central nervous system is the brain, and then you have the spinal cord. And then you have all these sense organs. So being able to see, being able to hear, being able to smell, being able to taste, and then touch. And in fact, our whole bodies are kind of wired for touching, especially if you actually look at the number of neurons in our fingertips. They're much higher density in their fingertips than, let's say, a patch of skin on your back. So, now, in terms of neurons, they have similar properties. Okay, there's different kinds of neurons. So this does not require thinking. These are kind of automatic reflexive. You have sensory neurons. So the tip of my tongue, I have all these taste buds, and I can taste all sorts of different kinds of chemicals. Sweet things, sour things, bitter things, savory things, all kinds of different things. Obviously, smell, same sort of way. So these are all sensory organs. They pick up what's going on in the outside world. There are some animals that have other senses than what humans do. For example, bats and also a lot of marine mammals can send out a signal like sonar, and they can actually get a picture of what their environment looks like because of the signals coming back. There's also a lot of fish that are electric fish, but weakly electric. And they use electrical fields for the same sort of thing. Okay? So, sensory neurons, and then they're usually connected in some way to interneurons, they carry signals from the sensory neurons, a lot of times up to the brain, but also to motor neurons. Okay, so it goes from sensory neurons to interneurons to motor neurons, and then motor neurons cause things to happen, like, let's say, muscle contraction. That's the effector. So reflexes are involuntary in response to some stimulus. So you've gone to the doctor where they tap your knee and your knee goes up and down and you don't have any control over it. Reaction to unexpected painful stimuli, right? Put your hand on something hot and you immediately take it away. Salivation in response to smells and gag response in terms of noxious stimuli. Now, these kinds of things do not require any thinking whatsoever. So let's say a monster comes into this room. A pig, dog, bear from South Park. And we know it's dangerous, we can tell. We don't think about what we should do at that time. We all jump out of our clothes, and then we run away. Okay? Or we freeze. Those are both reflective responses. If you actually had to think about something in that situation, you would probably be dead. Oh, what should I do now? Eat. It's already eaten you. So a lot of reflexes we have no control over them whatsoever. Now, cognitive responses, where we're aware of what we're doing, that's a different story. There's a different part of the nervous system that controls that. So, as I said, this is sensory neurons, interneurons, motor neurons, and then effectors, which are the things the neurons are actually attached to that actually do the work, whether it's muscles, whether it's secreting certain substances from glands like the thymus and the adrenal glands and all that. Now, there's, I guess you could divide the nervous system into two parts. And that's the central nervous system, brain and the spinal cord. And then the peripheral nervous system, which means all the nerve roots and nerves that are emanating from different parts of the spinal cord. And like I said, our body is absolutely covered in nerves. Some areas more so than others. So, in terms of vertebrates, the central nervous system, the brain is usually covered in a skull, hard bony plates, and the spinal cord is too, in terms of vertebrates. So, here's the vertebral column. And then, in terms of the skull, well, first of all, so here's the vertebral column, right? Pretty well protected. Some people get spinal injuries, and they usually are quadriplegic or paraplegic, but things are changing on that route in terms of stem cell therapies. And in the future, people might actually be able to recover. The brain has the skull, which is right there. Here's the spinal cord. The meninges, let's see here. I want to make sure I'm looking at this. I'm not sure. They're a thin layer that protects nervous system tissue. So like you can actually get a disease called spinal meningitis, which is infectious. It used to kill a lot of people. It's treatable by antibiotics now. Where those meninges get infected, you usually get a terrible headache. With really bad infections, of course, you can die. And then there's also, the brain is protected with a blood-brain barrier. In other words, it's protected so that things can't get through. Yeah?
Let's say you experience 1 or 2 concussions, like in the past.
Yeah.
Would it come back to haunt you down the line?
What's that?
Would it come back to haunt you and like hurt you down the
Oh, you mean getting after you've gotten a concussion?
Yeah, let's say like a younger.
Well, they used to think not. Really bad concussions, obviously, perhaps. But they're thinking now more so because of all the football concussions that they're seeing, and they're seeing, in fact, that even, kids that don't go on to play college or pro, they can sometimes have lingering effects. And now you're seeing it with pro football players especially. What was it called? Anyway, there's a lot of old football players who are, they have real serious dementia from too many blows to the head. Boxers used to get the same sort of thing, punch drunk, right? So over time, that sort of thing can actually, have long-lasting effects. Now, the NFL didn't want to admit that for a long time. In fact, no one did, but the evidence is very strong now. So there's a whole protocol. Whether it actually protects people or not, it's hard to say. Really young kids that, let's say, have a brain injury, whether it's a concussion or something more serious, are much more likely to recover from normal function than an old brain like me. Okay? So in terms of the nervous system. So there's a lot more plasticity in the young brain and nervous system than older people. Now, this blood-brain barrier protects the brain from infectious diseases. So now occasionally you get infections like of the meninges and stuff like that. But there's this whole setup so that things can't get through. In fact, the only energy molecules that it can get through are actually glucose. So nothing other than glucose passes through the blood-brain barrier. It's a good thing. It's also a thing that's kind of problematic because if you want to, let's say you want to administer drugs in terms of a brain problem, you have to be able to get it through the blood-brain barrier. So you just can't inject it or do an IV or something like that. You actually have to go use like a spinal tap or something like that to inject the drugs in, because otherwise they won't get through. So now, the brain has a tremendous amount of a blood supply. And you can understand that because the brain actually uses about 20% of all the energy that we consume. It's voracious. In other words, it's great that we are able to do these things, but it's very, very expensive. As an aside, that's why, some people say, oh, we're more highly evolved because we have a bigger brain and better cognitive capacity. Well, in a lot of cases, there's animals that don't, but they have much higher fitness than having a big brain because you spend such a large cost in terms of nutrients and things like that. So anyway, there's this blood circulation and blood supply of the brain, carotid artery, lots of capillaries, so that very fine blood vessels. When people get a stroke, it's usually because one of the arteries or one of the blood vessels is blocked. so the brain can't get oxygen, things like that. So the central nervous system has an amazing blood supply, and it has to. Now, this is the brain stem. Okay, right here, which is right here. It governs a whole bunch of stuff. It does not require cognitive thought. So it covers heartbeats, breathing, swallowing, a whole bunch of automatic functions. Is actually part of what's called the autonomous nervous system. The part of your nervous system that does not need, I mean, it just goes on and on and on if it's working properly. We don't have to think about breathing. We don't think about having to have, oh, beep, beep, beep. Don't have to do that, okay? So the brainstem, people usually with brainstem injuries, they're dead. They may be kept alive, but essentially they're going to be brain dead. Okay, there's other parts. Let's see, the cerebellum right here, a lot of motor control. Thalamus is a gland for relaying sensory information. There's a lot of hormones that are associated with it. The cerebrum. Now, there's a whole bunch of different parts to it, but the cerebral cortex, the outer part, is definitely associated with cognitive thought. And from what I understand, the frontal lobe, like is part of your executive function in terms of planning, making decisions, things like that. So there's a kind of dementia that happens with some people in terms of they lose control of their executive functions. There's also different parts that are associated with like language, Broca's area, obviously areas that are dedicated to sight, hearing. Oftentimes what happens is, let's say someone becomes blind or they're born blind. A lot of that area that was for sight is actually becomes rewired for dedicated for other things like better sound and hearing. So the brain is fairly plastic in how it can get rewired, especially early on. Now, it's kind of an amazing organ because it's not just, okay, you get senses coming in, but it has to integrate sight, sound. So you see something like that big, oh, we're just about ready to go. You know, a monster come in here. It has to integrate that sight and then the rest of our responses in terms of making the appropriate reactions. So we'll leave it there for now, and then we'll pick up next week where we'll finish up. Look at Top Hat for some new questions.